Backyard Professor Chess videos. I'm in my new man cave. I showed you I was doing my floor the other day. Yeah, I got it done and now I'm standing on it. My chessboard's a little higher. I think I like this. I think this will be easier to give you guys some ideas. I know several of you have asked about the Pirc Defense. And being the ignoramus that I am, I didn't know that much about the Pirc Defense either. So I started to look it up. You know, play through a few games. And the really interesting thing happened on the very first game I looked up the Pirc Defense. It was one that Bobby Fischer lost. And that, of course, immediately escalated my interest in this. I said, wait a minute, Bobby Fischer lost? However, it is based on who he lost to, Viktor Korchnoi. He missed the World Championship by just a hair. Korchnoi was absolutely in the top echelons of fabulous chess players. But to see Bobby Fischer lose to the Pirc Defense, now that has to say something. And since then I found several other games with the, Kasparov. I've got several by Fischer. I've got a few by Korchnoi. Anyway, what I like to do with these openings is give you, let's look at the philosophy, and then I'll give you several really cool, interesting games. Let me show you the idea behind the Pirc Defense. And this is just generic. This is just to introduce the defense. It was considered an inferior opening in the 20th century. They said nobody really liked it. Of course, pawn is going to open up with the roar with the king pawn. Now, white can also open up with the queen pawn, and it can transform from a queen pawn opening into the Pirc Defense real easy. Black appears with the d6 push to be somewhat intimidated. You know, white has completely terrified him with this magnificent central thrust of the king pawn, and the game is darn near over. Ha! Don't kid yourself. That's not how it works. However, with the d4 push, now black is aware. He's saying, okay, look, white is serious. Whenever you see your opponent as white open like this, and you come out with the measly d6, which is a very valuable move later on, you know you can do the Pirc Defense. The idea with the Pirc Defense is somewhat subtle. We're going to pull out a couple of knights. And the knight c3 for white, the knight f6 for the black, and now he goes g6. And you're saying, wait a minute, dude, isn't white really coming into the strong center, and haven't you said before that that's a great ideal? Yes, that's correct. Well, so why is black appearing to be so timid? I think the idea behind the Pirc Defense is interesting, that black is going to try to influence the center or to even attack the center through his pieces, not necessarily his pawns at first. So this kind of makes this really interesting. What black is going to eventually do, of course, is pull the bishop up here to g7, and now you can see he's coming at this d4 pawn, and he's coming out this way. And then white can develop really, really strongly. It's called the Austrian attack with that pawn to f4. And when white pushes that pawn to f4, here's the theme. Black does have a couple of different options. He can prepare to attack the center head on directly. He's not ready to do this just yet, but he can do so with pushing the e5. And I mean, it's as obvious as the nose on your face, even my crooked nose. This is a really oomph. Black is saying, okay, let's boogie, right? So this is one option black has as the defense. Another option is to play a quiet preparation move and bring out the knight to a6. And you say, I thought you said the knights on the rim are dim. They are, if you just leave them there. But what is the purpose of this point, of this thrust? What do you see on the board that shows the square that knight is influencing? Well, he's come up here into b4. And he's coming over here to c5. If he pulls the knight out to here, and then later he brings up the bishop to g4, by this time white, I'm not doing this in order, by this time white will have put the knight here, with the bishop to g4 pinning the knight to the queen, and with the knight on a6, what move is black preparing for? What move can you see? Let's explore this, because this is the basic philosophy of black with this particular kind of opening. Number one, black is going to attack the d4 pawn. And the reason we know that is because what this does is it prepares black to push the c pawn to c5. And he's attacking the d4. The knight to a6 gives this pawn support. The bishop coming out here to g4 gives this pawn support. Now this is interesting how it works, isn't it? Because by pinning this knight cannot protect that pawn. You see how that works? So these two major piece moves help support the fact for black to push this c pawn and attack the d4 square, a very important central square. All four central squares are worth fighting for, right? So this is basically the philosophical idea of the Pirc. So back to the general, one of the general openings. What white can do at this point, because he knows black is going to fianchetto the bishop, and he's well aware that black has a couple of different options. The fianchetto bishop also brings pressure to bear on the d4, so that moves like the knight and the bishop have to here eventually. Well, what can do? Here's the thing. With white's center being so strong, white automatically knows that his center is going to be attacked in one way or the other. So how do you solidify the center? One idea is to push the pawn to f3. That's not a bad choice. That gives you, granted, it stops the knight from coming up into here, but it really does give strong support according to Silman here. I'm taking this out of the brief analysis of Jeremy Silman, The Complete Book of Chess Strategy on the Pirc Defense, page 63, 64, and 65. One option here is the f3. Now, the downside, perhaps, if it is a downside, is that it stops the knight from coming to here, right? However, look at the upside. Black now has to be very wary about putting anything here on g4. See, the knight here cannot go to here. So in a way, this pawn thrust supports the center, and it prevents some black offense. It also prevents a bishop coming into here, or to here. So in a way, this simple little move, this simple pawn move, protects the king's side somewhat stronger while supporting the center. So that's not a bad option for white. And in some of my chess games, I show you how white did make that move. So black is going to bring the bishop out, fianchetto the bishop, and now bishop comes up here to e3, again supporting more of the center. Now, because of the last two moves white made, both of his e and d pawns are supported, strong in the center. The knight is hitting this pawn. This pawn can come up to e5 and directly challenge the center. This pawn can come to c5 and directly challenge the center as well. So the principle behind a couple of these moves is to give those pawns support, and it's pretty important to support them simply because they are central pawns, and the game can revolve around this. So white comes up here, black can now come to c6. Notice at this point with this particular idea, black is not necessarily immediately beginning the fight. He's going to build up the pressure. So he's making baby step pawn moves, more or less, so to speak. And of course, the queen is going to come up, and now you can do a b5 thrust because you have the support. One idea in this particular opening with the Pirc defense, because White's center is so solid, because he's got good support, and you know eventually when you have such a strong center like this with strong central pawns, you know he's going to elevate, he's going to push his pawns up the board, right? So as black, you don't want to be overrun, overwhelmed with White's steamrolling with the pawns, with the pieces behind the pawns, giving them support and mowing you over, right? One possible way is to begin your own steamroller on the queen side. Bring out the queenside pawns and go hard on the queenside. I mean, it's obvious in this opening that White has the central territory, and this is an important imbalance to recognize. So Black can make his own territorial expansion by coming out on the queen side. It makes perfect sense. The king, the center, I say, isn't necessarily open. It's not going to have a lot of traffic zinging through it back and forth with bishops and rooks at this point. It's too early. The pawns are not gone yet. So it's perfectly fine for Black to emphasize that queen space. And so he starts moving out. The Austrian attack, we're back to the third move. After the third move, Black's prepared to fianchetto the bishop, and White is ready to keep bringing up the centralized pressure. And we saw the last time where f3 really is a real good, it's more conservative, but it really gives central support to those pawns, which gives White a solid game, right? Black really has to chip away at White as well as build a defense. What happens when White goes with the Austrian attack? Instead of f3, he pushes f4. Now, this is basically a declaration of complete war. Of course, every time you sit down at the chessboard, it's a declaration of war. But this is really telling Black, I'm going to crush you. This is the Austrian attack. Does Black freak out? Well, no, not yet. Victor Korchnoi beat Bobby Fischer, and Bobby Fischer was using the Austrian attack. So, I mean, if the very, very pinnacle of the chess world can be defeated, then we've got a chance here. So, continue developing by fianchettoing your bishop. Now, with the Austrian attack, the nice thing for White, this gives White so many power options. I mean, it just does. Number one, you have a solid wall of pawns up there on the fourth rank. You're backing them up with the knights. I mean, yeah, that's good. That's solid. Black's defense is not doing shabby either. He's got options here and here. He's got this bishop lurking behind the knight. He can easily bring this bishop out here. He can bring up the knight and pawns, so on and so forth. White is putting maximum pressure against Black. Actually, what White wants to do is cramp Black. He wants to stick him on that side of the... And Black has to be careful, or he can be cramped. This is a very important way for Black to be cramped, so he has to counter attack. And of course, since the attack is going to be coming on, it's best that Black castles fast. Truly is. This is probably... And then, this, believe it or not, in a roundabout way, by castling, you actually prepare for that pawn move right there. You're not going to have to worry about any kind of attacks with the white pieces as badly. So you're preparing for the c5 thrust. And the only way to do that, I'll show you in several games, the only way for your Black to do that is to castle. Get that king out of the way. And now, of course, the bishops are going to start coming up, and you can see again more and more and more central support so that he can just kind of take it to Black. Now there are, with this declaration, White is telling Black, go ahead and do your best, because I'm going to wipe you off the board. One very excellent, really powerful counterattack that Black can do, and in many games does do, it's very interesting. He brings up pawn to e5 and he says, game on. Now, there are several games by Karpov and by Fischer and a few by Korchnoi and others where white is the one that makes it to e5 first. And really, I think like 95% of the games I played through about 20 of them that I found using the Pirc Defense. Man, when white can get to e5 first, after he's got the setup and development. You can't just do this with pawns necessarily. Although I've got a great game by David Bronstein I'll show you where he did that with just pawns. He darn near beat the Pirc Defense without any, not really, I'm exaggerating, but boy, the first like 6 moves were pawn moves. This is powerful. So I understand that it's not occupied at this point, but it is being fought for. That e5, I mean, you can see the difference. If black gets there before white, now black really says, pow. I'm going to pop you right in the kisser. And now you see all kinds of options that's going to happen here. If, instead of the e5 thrust, if black was to bring out the knight to c6, what's he doing? Now, later on, putting the knight here supports this pawn coming to here. Putting the knight on c6 directly pressures the d4 pawn. Again, with the same principle. With the bishop coming out here, putting the pin on this knight can no longer support that without losing the queen. So these two moves are other options that black can directly put pressure against the white center, specifically that d4 pawn. It seems like in the Pirc Defense, the white d4 pawn is going to be the one that's always beat up. It's either going to be the d4, or if white chooses to ignore that and go to e5, I've got some games that show that too. It's a real tough battle from this point. So you can kind of see some points that everyone's shooting for, some specific targets, we'll call them. That's one such target with that knight to c6. Now he says in all of the lines of the Australian attack, no matter what you're doing as black, when you see white opening with these 3 pawn thrusts and then start bringing up pieces to support those central pawns, you must seek counterplay against that huge white center, or you're going to be completely squashed. If white keeps bringing up those pawns, oh man, it gets brutal. And he's right, it does. Now, the difference between the Austrian attack and the Pirc Defense and the classical variation is in the classical variation, white develops in just simple logical fashion by bringing out the second knight. We've seen the option where he presses the f pawn to f3 to support the center. In the classical variation, he pulls the second knight out. Now, black will continue developing in exactly the same. You notice that if you studied openings, and I haven't a whole lot, but this is very similar to the modern opening. They usually put the Pirc and the modern opening together in the books to show you. This is very similar with the same type of philosophy. Black is going to attack the center from a distance. Not directly with pawns and pieces as such in the very opening, but he will influence the center later so that he can do a later couple of pawn thrusts with either the e pawn or the c pawn and the b pawn. He can build up space territory in the queen side if he so chooses. In the classical variation, white is simply developing a logical, solid fashion. And this is pretty powerful for white. There's several games illustrating this also. He's going to bring out his bishop. Now, of course, black's going to castle. I think in the I think in all the games that I've played through on the Pirc, I've got a couple dozen, most of them do castle, both sides castle, really early, really fast. In the classical, this is what they're doing. Is they have, white has claimed the center, now tuck the king to safety. Black has said, yes, you've claimed the center for now directly, but I have options that I'm going to build, but I'm going to castle before I begin my counterattack. So it's just straightforward, simple, logical thrust. Now, at this point, black can come over to here. And the idea, again, is because that knight is supporting the center on two really important critical squares, here and here. If the bishop can get rid of that knight, let's say the bishop finds a way. Let's say white had done this, for instance, threatening the bishop, and the bishop took the knight, and the bishop takes the bishop. Now, it's true, white has a piece here, but the squares of influence have changed dramatically. In a way, because black pulls his bishop and takes that knight, in this particular variation, he actually weakens white's center, doesn't he? He at least weakens the support for white center, because now d4 is more vulnerable. It has one less piece protecting it. Granted, the queen's protecting it, of course, but it's easy to pile on the attack on d4 if black decides to exchange that knight. This is one really good way that black can just systematically, step by step, attack the white center. Whether directly or indirectly is irrelevant to black. The point he wants to do is weaken the white center, because if you don't, man, that thing is going to come and mow you over. And remember, the e5 square is critical. So this is one option for black. Another one he can do, again, is the knight c6. Now you're almost in a four knights game here, aren't you? Because now we have all four knights, and we're all contesting the squares. You see how that works? So this is a fight for central territory in the most classical fashion. Everyone's coming out and hitting hard. Now, when black brings out his other knight, the intent for black is going to be the e5. I believe it. This comes out and hits d4, and now it makes perfect sense that e5 comes out and hits d4 again. So black made it to the e5 square first, and this is more or less his counterattack to the white overwhelming central presence. But you need the support. You gotta have some pieces in here to support those pawns. Unless, of course, you're a David Bronstein. So this is the idea here. Now, if black were to, at this point in the classical variation, if black were to bring his knight to here, which is a good development, it's perfectly logical, again, what he's preparing for is not the C thrust, but the E thrust. You can do this, but so far as I'm aware, and I'm not aware of a whole lot yet, I'm looking, I don't see a lot of the real good top players doing the C thrust when they put the knight here. Granted, it is preparing for that, and it is guarding it, but what they're doing is going for the E. Again, that E5 square is so vital in this fight, so that the knight is giving that support. The knight is giving it indirect support because the bishop is giving it support. The pawn is giving it support. The knight is giving it support. There's other ways where black will come to here and give it yet more support. So you can see black has some pretty good options against, in the Pirc defense, black has some really good options against this wonderful white center. You don't have to be completely scared. and think that you're completely wiped out and done if he brings this out. And the other one, oh yeah, black doesn't have to respond directly to the white center, but if you don't, then you have to gain some territory of your own, or you're going to end up being really cramped. And one possibility is the C6. And the theme here that you're looking for when you start doing that is the queenside expansion. And then you go from there. So that's yet again another option. Rather than pulling the knight out to here or here, you can go ahead and expand and give yourself territory. Because with more territory is more room to maneuver your pieces to coordinate either a defense or an attack, right? So territory is really critically important in the chess opening. And then another option, I think I've already said this, is the knight to A6. And this idea here is he's hitting here and here. Now, if you didn't, as black, if you weren't going to directly respond to the white center, the theme here with this is to, is to give you C6, and then it's going to give you expansion that way. You're hitting up into here. Well, you can't hit that because then you'll have a knight outpost after the pawns are taken. The idea with doing any of the wing thrust with the B and the C pawn and the knight is to give you queenside territory, because it's obvious white wants to keep expanding like a, you blow up a balloon. White's blowing up that center, so you want your extra territory on the queen side. And so far as I've seen, I'm still looking through games, of course, but I haven't seen a lot of kingside activity until later on in the game when they really do a kingside attack. There are some phenomenal kingside attacks, and white mowing the opponent over through that. So I've shown you the Austrian attack and the classical variation, and a few options as white and as black. I've shown you the philosophy that white is going to immediately claim powerful central territory. One of the ways that I've seen done the most is when white pushes that pawn first. This is a very used, I know Bobby Fischer used this a lot with devastating effect. He was very powerful when he got all those pawns up on all the knights and the bishops in there. That was powerful. Black, on the other hand, has usually countered with either the C pawn thrust, the C5 pawn, or the E5. And when they do that, when they can get that kind of a central thrust with that C and that E pawn, then black has pretty good game. He's got some counterplay possibilities. So there's the Pirc defense as a general philosophical option. I really do. I have about a dozen really excellent games on the Pirc that I really want to share with you. For nothing else, they're just fun to play through and see how these guys play this game. And specifically this defense. And then for two, the instruction value and the practice is absolutely excellent. So stick around, man. I'm going to get into some Pirc defense games from some seriously excellent chess tournaments. In the meantime, remember, have fun, do well, be good. Enjoy your life, study some chess, beat the dog, kick the wife. No, I didn't say it. No, and watch out because the wife will kick you back too, and the dog bites. So it's best to be nice to everybody around you. That way you can have an enjoyable time playing chess. So, study hard, and I will see you in the next chess video.